There we go. There's a recording. So why don't I start with, I'll do this approximately in alphabetical order. So Anna Cash, City of Berkeley, would you give us an intro, name, title, organization, and how were you involved in developing or implementing the Berkeley housing preferences?
Sounds good. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Anna Cash, Housing Policy Specialist at the City of Berkeley in our Health, Housing, and Community Services Department. And I've been with the city as a official city employee for about 2 years, and then was a Partnership for the Bay's Future Fellow placed at the city and working with community organizations to pass community-driven anti-displacement policy prior to that for 2 years. So one of the policies, and we'll get into this, that we were focusing on was the affordable housing preference policy. So my role as a fellow was to really work with community organizations like Healthy Black Families to develop that policy in a community-driven way and kind of help shepherd it on the city side. And now I'm involved in the implementation of the policy.
Thank you, Anna. And then Nick, would you kindly give us an intro?
Yeah, hi, my name is Nick Griffin. I'm Director of Asset Management at RCD, Resources for Community Development. I work with our property management company, the John Stewart Company, to administer our lease-ups. At RCD, I've overseen something like 14, 15 lease-ups, and previously when I was a project manager at TNDC, Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation, was involved in lease-ups there as well. And as you'll hear, Maudel Miller Sherrick Community is the first to implement this policy.
Thank you, sir. And Wilhelmina.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Wilhelmina Wilson, and I'm the Executive Director at Healthy Black Families. We're a community-based nonprofit public health organization based in the Adeline Corridor in Berkeley. And we operate through the lens of the social determinants of health. So housing is a big piece of our focus and what we do as we drive for equity for our communities.
Thank you. And we have a special guest star giving a cameo today. Mama Ayana, would you give us a quick intro, please?
Good morning. My name is Ayana Davis. I'm Deputy Executive Director at Healthy Black Families with the focus on policy advocacy and program governance. My place here is having worked with Anna Cash and the East Bay Community Law Center to survey community, craft design, bring community input into the affordable housing preference policy. And I continue to work with Healthy Black Families to make sure the community understands the policy, can apply, and we will be doing policy outreach. If anyone would like us to come speak to your organization about the preference policy, please let me know. I'll put my name in the chat, my number in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, thanks everybody for your introduction. And thanks everyone for joining today to our panel topic, Implementing Displacement-Focused Housing Preferences through a Digital Affordable Housing Application Portal. We didn't wordsmith that. That's a long title, but we have a lot to talk about today. So excited to have you all here. Cool. And let's get us started. If I can turn it over to you, Wilhelmina, to give us some context for this work and tell us a little bit more about your involvement in this, please.
Thank you, Barry. Yeah, we're really happy to have been part of this policy development and shepherding it through the City Council and a unanimous approval. And now to a place where we're actually, seeing how the rubber meets the road and really how it gets implemented. Healthy Black Families is an organization that has a mission for providing people with knowledge, skills, and strategies to make social systems and policies more equitable for Black people and communities. We believe that if we service those who are most vulnerable, that everybody will benefit. And so our focus really is on uplifting Black communities, To accomplish this, we organize, provide political education for individuals and families, and equip them with skills to help advance social justice and equity through the community. I'm going to share our work and kind of ground this policy work through a historical context that's very personal to me. We can go to the next slide. You know, as we broach and engage the topic of displacement-focused housing preferences as a contemporary conversation, I think it's important to set historical context for our discussion. I've chosen to do this via personal context that I believe will establish a foundation for the importance of these policies. It's really beneficial in my perception to ground it in a historical context because it's through this broader perspective that we truly come to understand the genesis of this problem that we're trying to solve and how the circumstances that created the disparities we experience today are rooted in our collective history. I think it's wonderful that this is Mother's Day month. This beautiful woman on this slide is my mother. Her name is Lucy Wood Wilson. I'm the youngest of 5. My mother was born in 1918, which connects me to an era that I think is sometimes lost to us. She grew up in rural North Carolina, and her family ties us to the place depicted on the slide here. It's a place called Somerset Place. Somerset Place was one of the most prosperous plantations in North Carolina in the 1700s and 1800s, mostly because of its proximity to the waterway. My ancestors, Sally and Kofi, were amongst the first enslaved Africans to arrive at Somerset Place on a ship called the Camden in 1786 after being kidnapped and sold into enslavement from their homes in West Africa. When Sally arrived at Somerset, she was 9 years old. She and her life partner, Kofi, are one of 2 multi-generational family lineages hailing from this space, and I am their 7th generation descendant. Depicted in the picture are the big house, which was occupied by the plantation owner, Josiah Collins, and his family. This 14,000 plus square foot palatial residence was occupied by 6 Collins family members and a few of the enslaved servants who supported them. Below the big house is one of the many slave quarters that were present on Somerset Place property. In this property, more than 30 enslaved people resided as they worked from dawn to dusk to make the Collins family business profitable with no remuneration for their labor. This is the story of my family's roots and the way that we were disenfranchised from the American dream. As we talk about place and space, and the who is worthy of quality space and place paradigms, we are wise to look at our history and how the seeds of value cast forward in this era set the course that has placed us in the reality where we find ourselves today. While my legacy sprouts from enslavement on a rural North Carolina plantation, there are stories of extraction and displacement found in the lives of all Indigenous people in our nation. For Native American people, the Trail of Tears is drenched with their blood and suffering, and the stories once revealed continue to inform opportunities for how we move forward equity in our era. Next slide, please. So as we come to this work, Equity for Black Berkeley is an initiative that came out of the mayor's office in the city of Berkeley. They entitled their initiative Equitable Black Berkeley, and we kind of rebranded it to make it more resonant for us. But it's the beginning of the city of Berkeley repairing harm to the Black community caused by institutional racism, segregation, and redlining. Our situation is not unique. The paradigms that decimated the economic center of the Black community in Berkeley, spawned on by transportation initiatives, have impacted urban communities all over the nation. Over the course of 2 years, Healthy Black Families engaged community members to discern, and consider the opportunity to create a thriving Black Berkeley as we're looking at redesigning the Adeline corridor, really with a core focus around a transportation-oriented development at the Ashby BART station. Through 2 years of people's assemblies, events, engaging where we sought to educate, engage, and collect data from community using human-centered design research techniques. Healthy Black Families was able to collect over 1,900 inputs from community members in response to the inquiry of how do we create a thriving Black Berkeley? Next slide, please. We really want to give a lot of honor and gratitude to a group of young folks from Berkeley that we enrolled in a Healthy Black Families Fellowship program. They supported us in coalescing all of this data into 9 categories that we then had the community prioritize based upon. And through that, we were able to establish the community's priorities. Next slide, please. The evening before we did the prioritization, we had these events on Saturdays. Our brilliant program manager, Erin Alexander, called me and said, Nina, do you think we need to understand the difference between the Black community's perspective and our allies' perspective? And I was like, yeah, let's disaggregate that data. How do we do that? She says, well, let's just get different color dots. So we began doing that as we were prioritizing. And so we gave those who identified as Black in our community Black dots to prioritize, and our allies green dots. And so this is the first time we did that exercise. And you can see the variation in the data beginning to show up here. This really gave another context to the conversation and gave us a way to share publicly why the Black community has to be centered in the solutions around this. The variation in perspectives is such that that's the only way we're really going to get the outcomes the Black community really desires. Next slide, please. So these are the priorities that came out. Our highest priority is housing, followed by health and community. Healthy Black Families now is in the process of doing some detailed journey mapping with community members to suss out the nuances around their experiences in each of these areas. And then the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about the details of housing. So these were the priorities when we dwelled down into the housing category itself. Housing policy was the first focal area. And that's a perfect segue into the conversation we're having today about the affordable housing preference policy. How do we create policies based on the limitations we have at the state level to really support the type of housing that we want to have? The second was affordable home ownership. So this is not a monolith. Communities are interested not only in affordable housing, but also in how do they purchase homes? How do we create that American dream of building wealth that we can transfer from generation to generation in some of our most marginalized communities? Also co-op housing. The community is very interested in how we secure housing and keep it affordable into perpetuity, based on the capitalistic motives that seem to lead the energy in our current paradigm. And then affordable housing, of course. We're looking to do something extraordinary at the Ashby BART station. The community is calling for 100% affordable housing. And that looks like staggered housing, from housing for graduate students and firefighters and teachers, all the way down to very low income housing. And then, really, as we look at policies like TOPA, Tenants Opportunity to Purchase Act, how do we do financial education with our community to really prepare them to be able to take advantage of some of the powerful policies we're trying to bring forward, and retain some of that ownership over across generations. And I think that summarizes my opening comments, Barry, and I'll pass it back to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Wilhelmina. That's really fantastic. Great. Well, I'd love to hand it off then to Anna to give us a little bit of a story about how the housing preferences were developed in San Francisco and transition, from live work to these more vibrant displacement preferences. Would love your thoughts, Anna.
Yeah, I'm actually gonna pass it to Ayana for her feature here. This was work that we did together that Healthy Black Families really played a leadership role in. So, Ayana, if you want to lead us off, I'm happy to chime in.
Fine. Is there another slide? I think it has my talking points, but
Okay, am I taking this one and then I'll pass it to you? Is that?
I think
Okay,
that's.
got it. Sorry about that.
Thank you,
So,
Anna.
okay, so I think on the next slide, Ayana is going to speak to some of the how did we get here. But I think, as with any community-oriented policy, the story starts with the community organizing and the issues that it responds to. So, gentrification and displacement have been taking place in historically Black South Berkeley for a very long time. And between 1990 to 2018, Berkeley lost half of its Black population at the same, during the same time period as all other racial groups in our city were holding steady or growing slightly. And that's during a time period where you're seeing rents go way up. You're seeing all of these displacement pressures that do push people out, and hearing from community, displacement is happening, it's real. Folks are still commuting in to stay connected to community and experiencing all of the traumatic impacts of displacement and the ways that displacement takes place and the experience of being dislocated from community. So as there was discussion at the city about the Adeline Corridor specific plan and the sort of redevelopment of the Adeline Corridor that goes through the heart of South Berkeley, a lot of community groups, South Berkeley-based community groups, Black-led community groups in Berkeley, became very vocal about that plan and what the Black community needed to see in that plan, to respond to the gentrification and displacement pressures. And at the same time, a conversation was happening with BART about the redevelopment of the Ashby station in South Berkeley that Mina spoke to earlier, and the North Berkeley BART station, and redeveloping those for housing. So given all of the gentrification and displacement pressures and the ways that those issues were disproportionately impacting the Black community and continue to, that's really where some community organizing that was specifically calling for a preference policy that addressed these displacement pressures and helps people to either stay in Berkeley in the face of those pressures or to return if they've already been pushed out, which we know is a lot of people given where we are at in Berkeley's displacement crisis. That's where I think a really, clear call for that preference policy or right of return came in. And I'm going to hand it off to Ayana to speak a little more to that and to the journey to developing that preference policy.
Thank you, Anna. I came into this work as part of a Black community leaders group representing healthy Black families and also our South and West Berkeley community. Under the Partnership for the Bay's Future Challenge grant, the city had put out the call for developing a preference policy, starting with the Berkeley Considers survey. And as we began to talk with Anna Cash and the East Bay Community Law Center as a group, we looked at the fact that there needed to be community outreach for this, and the community leaders group chose Healthy Black Families to support with the survey group work outreach. And as we looked at this survey, I realized that it was not going to suit the needs of the community. So we took the survey and went to multiple groups and crafted the Right to Stay, Right to Return survey, and continued to keep engaged the Healthy Black Families Board of Directors and staff, East Bay Community Law Center Community Leaders Group, the Black Community Leaders Group, African American Holistic Resource Center Advisory Committee, that we brought this survey before the Housing Advisory Commission, Housing Authority Board of Directors, Berkeley Rent Board, and Friends of Adeline are some of the other organizations that we got input from as we crafted the survey, surveyed community with both surveys, and then came together under the leadership of the East Bay Community Law Center and anchored by Anna Cash's excellent work with between the community organization, Healthy Black Families, and East Bay Community Law Center in the City of Berkeley. We designed and created a preference policy, went back in front of the community. All of these organizations and more got input and came forward with the final policy and brought it before the Housing Authority Board, the Housing Advisory Commission, the Rent Board, and again, the city came forth with the final policy. The preference policy was adopted by council unanimously on July 11th, 2023, and came into law on January 1st, 2024. When we talk about community-driven engagement, it's important to note that all through this process, we had community input. The preference policy is based on the preferences the community deemed were important, that should be there. The input was broad-based and often very intricate and intricately done. That said, we now have a policy in place. I think the work that we're doing under the Right to Stay, Right to Return, as the city builds 9,000 units, as we work to create equity for Black Berkeley, and as we bring and invite community back, it's important to give preference to those families that have been displaced, those families and persons that are housing insecure, unhoused, and our most vulnerable community members, families with children and families with low or no income. But we also understand that we have a large group of community members that have been displaced in Berkeley, and we also have a lot of people throughout the county that need housing. The preference policy gives us the opportunity to give families, in particular displaced and housing insecure families, an opportunity to have housing that they can afford and homes during this crisis and this unprecedented mass displacement of Black people from Berkeley. I'm complete.
Thank you, Ayana. Yeah, and thank you, Mina. It's an honor to just to be in this space and talking about this work with people who made it happen, right? And as I said, this story really starts with the community organizing that we were just speaking about, that Ayana and Mina were speaking about. And I'm grateful to have been a part of a really community-driven policy development process where people who are closest to the community impacts and the lived experiences of displacement shaped the policy initiative. And I think that's something really to stress about this policy. And, you know, happy to connect with other cities who are trying to develop policies in that way. And I think it's important to stress also that that work has to kind of continue into the implementation and the outreach. We're now sort of at the rubber meets the road part of this policy, where we can learn about how it's going, learn about how we can do better in reaching people and making this process accessible for the folks who it's designed to benefit. So but first, I'm going to take a step back and speak a little bit about the policy itself. So the housing preference policy is a city policy that assists people who have faced or are facing displacement in Berkeley to receive, if you can just go back one slide, to receive priority for new affordable housing units. So it applies to units in Berkeley's below market rate or inclusionary program, as well as nonprofit affordable units funded by Berkeley's Housing Trust Fund. And it's an important, it's just one piece of many efforts to address gentrification and displacement and equity, but it's an important step to make sure that new affordable rental housing in Berkeley, which is really just starting to be developed at a faster pace, can help address displacement in a more targeted way. Next slide, please. So the preference policy implements the goals identified by the community and city council of responding to displacement that's already occurred and helping people to stay in Berkeley who are struggling to do so, as well as acknowledging and addressing historic injustices. So these are all the preference categories that came out of that process that Ayana was describing. So first, there's preferences related to direct displacement. So displacement due to eminent domain for the construction of the BART stations in Berkeley in the 1960s and 70s. And then a preference category for displacement due to no fault or non-payment eviction in Berkeley. And then displacement due to foreclosure in Berkeley. So those are the sort of direct displacement categories. Then there are preferences for ties to redlined areas. So one preference point for a current or former address in a redline neighborhood, and an additional point if you have generational ties there. So either your parent or grandparent lived in a redline neighborhood. And, that's not just about acknowledging a historic injustice, though it is about that, but it is also about helping people stay in or return to these communities that have faced the most displacement pressures in the city, which are the formerly redline neighborhoods of South and West Berkeley. And then a preference for those who are homeless or at risk of homelessness. And finally, a preference for families with children with a goal of increasing community cohesion, since families are being displaced from social networks and the school district and often continuing to commute back long distances to go to school. So the way that these work is that the preference for, those who had their homes taken due to eminent domain, that's a first priority. And then other applicants receive, the other preference categories, I should say, are worth 1 point each. And after a lottery is conducted, that wait list is sorted by the total number of preference points you have. So recognizing that these are cumulative and intersectional experiences and harms, those, applicants are prioritized based on the total number of preference points they have. Okay, so next slide, please. So I know we have a lot of government folks on the call, so I'm going to speak a little bit to implementation planning. So, this policy was not one that you can just adopt and put on the books. There's a lot that we did before the policy was even adopted to prepare for implementation. So that included coordinating with the housing portal on incorporating the preferences, as well as including a geographic lookup feature for the addresses in redline neighborhoods. Compiling historical records from BART of names and addresses of people who had had their homes taken by eminent domain. So those Public Records Act requests and compiling a database from old documents takes time. And fair housing analysis. So that's a requirement from some of the other funding agencies that fund affordable housing, and helps us understand what the potential impacts on different groups could be of a preference policy. So that analysis takes time and is also important to plan for. So the policy was adopted July 11th, 2023, and it had an effective date of January 1, 2024. So once it was adopted and we had that effective date, that's when we were able to more concretely engage both internal and external stakeholders. So we use that time between adoption and the policy becoming effective to develop procedures and admin guidelines and, taking a really iterative approach and conducting human-centered design processes with our staff in different divisions who work with residents in a variety of ways, and also engaging healthy Black families. And engaging the affordable housing developers and, pivoting as we better understood their processes, especially RCD. And engaging the city's internal communications team on outreach planning to really get the word out. So we received approval from state HCD, Housing and Community Development, to implement on the Maudel Miller-Sherrick Community Project shortly before the end of last year. So once the policy became effective January 1 of this year, it really required that we stay nimble and respond to those evolving community needs. With the applications for the Maudel Miller-Sherrick community opening up in January, the month that the policy became effective, and just a few weeks after that approval, we had to do a big push on outreach in the lead up and really pivot along the way. So for example, we heard concerns about accessibility and began offering in-person assistance sessions for some of the online applications on the city side, and moved quickly to tailor developer trainings that would support implementation on this project. Next slide, please. And there were a few key things with the application process that we wanted to ensure. So number one was minimize burden on applicants. So applicants don't need to verify their preference eligibility beforehand. As you can see on this image, questions about preferences are incorporated into the online housing portal pre-application. Applicants can apply for a BART construction displacement certificate and foreclosure certificate to pre-certify those with the city, just to support applicants, since those documents go beyond proof of address and could take longer to get or require creativity, especially with the historical piece. So we do offer at the city the certificates for those two specific, the BART eminent domain and the foreclosure preferences, also just to minimize delays once we get into the actual lease up process. Another piece is reduce added burden on affordable housing providers. So we engage local affordable housing providers during policy development and implementation planning to collaborate on how to best fit into their existing processes and minimize delays. So it's not just a directive from the city and then walking away. We knew that with something so complex and new, it was really important to work with the people who will be implementing. And at the same time, I want to be clear that we actually don't have new staff for this at the city. So we couldn't be pre-certifying everyone beforehand for everything. So implementation planning had to really balance city staff capacity and the goal to minimize burden for other stakeholders. So one example is, the developer verifies the preference documentation and eligibility just for those applicants that are being selected for an interview for a unit. And the city created a preference verification form and process and identified places in the process that the city can support, such as coordinating with the rent board to get a database so we can check that for people who can't find their eviction notices. And we've been in really close contact with our CD to answer questions and co-create processes and be adaptive. And then really minimizing barriers. So again, asking for the documentation of preference eligibility really only happens when applicants are being contacted for an interview for a unit. And the goal is to screen people in and help them qualify for any preferences they're eligible for. So, Berkeley's preference policy took some inspiration from Portland's preference policy. And we've been in close touch with their staff to consult their really inclusive list of documentation and understand some places where they've over some years of implementing, been able to minimize documentation, for example, using a family tree form in certain cases instead of having people obtain multiple birth certificates. And we formed a partnership with the Berkeley Public Library so that they can use their institutional ancestry.com account, phone books, city directories, other tools to really make it easier for folks, help them demonstrate their relationship to someone who lived in a house that was acquired by BART. And, we're learning a lot as we go and working with RCD really closely to verify preferences on the pilot project. And, we'll pivot as we learn more. So next slide, and I'll wrap it up with this final one. So the first building to implement the preference policy process is the Maudel Miller-Sherrick community. This building is in the heart of South Berkeley, around the corner from Ashby BART, and has Healthy Black Families offices on the ground floor. So this was a really amazing opportunity to implement the preference policy. And as I mentioned, it came up quickly, the same month that the policy became effective. The building received almost 10,000 applications. So I think that number really highlights the stark need for affordable housing that we're all familiar with on this call. And also that technology in the portal maybe, facilitates those applications and access to the applications. So we're going to know more about, preferences and how this has all gone after verification of the applications for this building is complete. I can share now a little bit about like limited certificates issued thus far. So we've received 43 applications for BART certificates. So that's for eminent domain due to the construction of the BART stations. And we've only been able to issue one of those certificates thus far. And we've received 10 foreclosure certificate applications and issued 4 certificates. Yes, okay, noted. Do you want to jump in now, Ayana?
Oh, not at all, but
Okay.
as soon as you finish.
All right,
then.
I'll pass it to you in a minute. So I think that really highlights just that this is an engagement intensive process. We were thrilled to be able to get last minute approval for this project from HCD, but we have a lot of big engagement and outreach plans together with Healthy Black Families. We're partnering to refine our initial outreach materials to describe this process, which has lots of parts, in more user-friendly ways, especially for varying literacy levels, and to host events and get the word out to families who lost their homes to see if they might want to come back, right? And this kind of policy, which is unique in that it's designed to reach people who may no longer be in the city of Berkeley, right? It's designed to help people who have already been displaced. Cities are used to reaching out to their residents, right? So that's kind of a new outreach aspect and function to think through. And I think, partnering with a community organization is really key on that kind of work, because that's about social networks and reaching folks who may no longer be living within the city. And then we'll also continue to work closely with RCD to get data on the demographics of who used which preferences and who ultimately ends up in a unit. And collecting that data will be really key to understand who's being served by the policy and how it can best meet its stated goals. So I think Nick's going to speak to some of the data from the application process, but I'm complete with that, and I'll turn it over to Ayana for.
Yeah, just briefly, I wanted to give a little context to this. As a City of Berkeley resident whose family has historical roots that go back to the late 1800s, and having lived here since 1969 and have family, I'm the mother of 7, 6 boys and a daughter, and I've worked really diligently as an activist and organizer in this community since I was 16 years old. And one of the things that I've done over the years is advocate, organize, create for my community, believing that my family and my children, I was creating a community for my family and children and all the families that they grew up with, and to look around and see a different community, different populations and demographics, and feeling no ill will toward anyone, but understanding that this is a different way that communities have developed. We no longer live with our families and friends up the street or around the corner. And as we build the right to stay and right to return and right to own in equity for Black Berkeley, one of the first things I've seen with this preference policy is a couple of the young people that came up with my children, they are at the top of their part of the list, right? They're going to get housing. They're ecstatic about that. One of my children is at, I think they're number 300 and something, and he is also ecstatic. He's like, Mom, just to think I have the possibility of being able to move back to Berkeley, back to our neighborhood, and live and raise my children in housing I can afford, he couldn't have imagined it before this. And I think that's really important for us to keep in context, that we have community that has been unhoused, dying on the streets, couch surfing, living in their cars, and who have been paying exorbitant rents far beyond their ability to pay, that now are going to have opportunities to live and thrive in Berkeley. And as we talk about a thriving Berkeley, we want to be clear that Berkeley can thrive only if we have equity.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that input. Thank you also, Anna, for that. And why don't we hand it off to Nick, tell us a little bit, give us some detail about the process and the listing.
Sure. Hi. Again, Nick Griffin, RCD, and I come to this, as I said earlier, having been part of many lease-ups. I also was, as I maybe mentioned, a project manager in the Tenderloin in San Francisco for 12 years. And one assumes when you're doing that work, you're building for the community of the Tenderloin, people who were extremely overhoused and in, low quality housing conditions. And yet that's not the case. Due to fair housing, you need to market broadly, and the larger community ends up getting that housing, not necessarily your local residents. Similarly, at RCD, we did a project in another county, and we cast a broad net and marketed to that county, but also to Alameda County. And when, at the end of the day, the residents who moved in, the majority were from Alameda and not the other county, and almost none, if not none, of people from the actual subject city moved into that property. So I have an awareness of what the needs are, and the benefits of a local preference are. At the same time, also understand that the Alameda County Housing Portal, and the slide is showing the portal and the application information, and to the right is how the preferences are placed or are presented. The portal has a subscriber list now in excess of 90,000 people. So whenever a listing is posted, it gets broadly distributed to 90,000 people. We in our marketing send out our marketing materials to about 175 community agencies throughout Berkeley, but also throughout the county. And so that's what leads to the turnout that we get. And as Anna said, there were 9,960 applications, 13% of which were flagged as duplicates, and we worked through that. So the total is somewhat less than 9,000. Next slide, please. What this slide shows is the responses by AMI, area median income. And you can see that nearly half of the applicants reported incomes of less than 20% AMI. So what's considered extremely low income, 30% and below is considered extremely low income. You can see also that the 50 and 60% AMI income levels have the totals here of 1,000 and nearly 500 applicants. Next slide, please. I'll speak to what that refers to. So here is our distribution. This may be a little hard to read on your screen, but it's our distribution of the units by the unit size, by the income restriction, which is shown to the left, 20% AMI, 30% AMI. And then to the right is what those income caps are to qualify to be, at that or under to qualify for the units, the apartments. We use the term units. We try to use apartments when we're speaking more broadly. And you can also see that amongst the studios, several of them are NPLH. NPLH, the property is 86 units, of which 12 are no place like home units. It's a state funding program to provide housing to households who at the time are homeless and with a serious mental health disorder. And so we have 12 of those units. They get project-based vouchers, rental subsidy from Berkeley Housing Authority. In addition, there are 10 other units that get that subsidy. And you can see that distribution here. So back to that other chart, after those 22 units are occupied, and they're all at the lower incomes, 30 and 20%. We only have, if you flip to the next slide, we only have 3 units at 30% AMI at the very bottom, the third row from the bottom. We only have 3 units at 30% AMI for 3-bedroom households. So what that means is the 12 No Place Like Homes come from a county referral. The coordinated entry is a program dictated down by HUD that all counties implement through their continuum of care agencies. So the county administers that. And then we have the 10 other. So after those, we have the 3 at 30% of the 3 bedrooms. So nearly half of our applicants, by virtue of the income they self-reported, won't qualify for units other than those 3 bedrooms, unless they happen to get one of those 10 project-based voucher units. And that's a reflection of just how projects like this are financed. You have the extremely low income on one end, some of which are subsidized, and often now, because of the funding sources, house formerly homeless households. And then at the other end, so that the project can cash flow and actually support its operations, you have households at the higher income levels, 50 and 60% AMIs. And again, this data shows the high proportion of households that applied that were single person households, 51%, followed by 24% of 2-person households. And again, after the No Place Like Home and the PBVs, the majority of the units are again at 50 and 60% AMI, and then several are at 2-bedroom and 3 bedrooms. And there's minimum occupancy requirements imposed by the jurisdictional lenders. So it shows just the distribution of the applicants versus the housing that's available. Next slide, please. And again, the program is geared to be in a local preference. Obviously, by what you heard from Lamina and Ayana and Anna, a lot of City of Berkeley involvement. And when all was said and done, this is kind of the distribution of the self-reported addresses that the applicants came from. So predominantly from Oakland, which is consistent across applications throughout the county, and then about 10% from the City of Berkeley. And interestingly, 630 or 6.3% from San Francisco.
Can
And
I
then,
with something very, very quick on that?
sure.
I just want to clarify, a lot of times when people hear local preference, they think of a traditional live-work preference. And given what we've shared about how much displacement has already taken place in Berkeley, it's entirely possible that some people who would benefit from the preferences that are related to displacement are living in other parts of the Bay Area, these other cities of origin. So I just wanted to make that quick footnote.
And then moving on. Demographically, you can see the breakdown, and it's just fairly consistent with another Alameda County Housing Portal lease up we did 3 years ago, Coliseum Place, down by the Coliseum, and as well as the general demographic material from the Alameda County Housing Portal. Fairly consistent representation distribution. This is a conversion rate through the application, through the portal, the number of people who look at the listings, and then you can see a drop off to the number who actually start the application, and then a significant drop off to those who actually submitted the application. It's important to analyze this data and see what the obstacles are that lead to those drop offs, and view the preference policy and the complications the preferences provides within the application within that context.
Nick,
So now moving on.
Sorry, I just want to jump in for a sec. I know we're going along here. We want to be sure that we can get to folks' questions, probably not during our session today, but please do put your questions in the chat or reach out to any of us if you have questions. And I promise I will make sure that we get back to you with answers to your questions. So don't hesitate to do that. Sorry, Nick, back to you.
Yeah, and I'll go quickly through these in case we do have some time at the end. And Anna's reported on this one that we received through the application process, 204 people indicated they have applied for or were applying for the BART displacement certificate. And of those, as Anna reported, 43 have actually submitted an application, but only one qualified and was issued. Next slide. That's my timer. For the foreclosure, again, done through their certification process, 75 households indicated they were displaced due to foreclosure. In actuality, only 10 have submitted for the preference and 4 have been approved thus far. Next slide. In relation to redlining, 47 indicated that they were residents of a formerly redlined neighborhood in Berkeley. There was a geocoding cross-check by the address input into redlining maps, and that confirmed that 37 of those addresses actually were in redline districts previously. And then the preferences Anna described also is for descendants of residents. And there were 417 who indicated it, 310 passed the address check. And then we'll be processing people individually as we call them in. Next slide. In relation to homeless, this preference is a little nuanced. There are 1,417 indicated they were currently or previously homeless in Berkeley, and 805 indicated that for at-risk status, and there's a long detailed list of what is the criteria for that, and 205 who indicated both. And of all those, what is that, 2,400, 555 stated a current Berkeley address. We sent over to the city who we thought we were going to get to, who indicated this preference, because as you can see is quite a few, 2,400, who we might get to via the preference points and the ranking in the waiting list by the preference points. The city has screened 83. 10 of those are in the HMIS system, which is, oh geez. Anna, what does HMIS
Homeless
stand for?
Management Information System. It basically means,
Thanks.
yeah, done the assessment.
And 65 need to be assessed in order to get into the system. And 8 of those who are in the system, because of their acuity assessment, are eligible for or already on the coordinated entry waiting list to get directly placed into permanent supportive housing. And this preference is for those who are not on that waiting list, but otherwise homeless. And so you can see how this one's shaking out as well. Next slide, please. And then for evictions, and one of the preferences is with children, there are 4,087 households that indicated they had children, but 302 of those were actually single-person households. And then of two-person households, 154 of the 1,481 who were a two-person household, the second person they listed was actually an adult and not a child. So some of those don't meet the criteria and it'll be screened out. And indicated that they were displaced due to eviction in Berkeley over the prior last 7 years, whether residing here or no longer residing here, but the eviction occurred here. There were 264 who indicated that, and we will be screening them and calling them in for interviews as their priority preference points come up.
Excellent.
Next slide.
I think that's it. Well, thanks so much, Nick, for that. Thank you, Wilhelmina. Thanks, Ayana. Thanks, Anna. I realize I failed to introduce myself. I wanted to sort of stand down here. I'm Barry Roeder, and I manage the Doorway program for the new Bay Area Housing Finance Authority. And we're I have to say that it's a real honor for this portal to be at all involved in this incredibly important work. Anna mentioned the geocoding function that allows us to sort of on the fly, real time, assess an address and say, okay, that was part of a red line or that was part of a, so there's some cool stuff that we're able to do. And it's really wonderful that that technology can be in service of these very important things. So thanks to everybody for joining us today. Again, my thanks to all the panelists. If you have any questions, please follow up to this. Thanks for the ones that folks have reached in the chat. We'll get back to all of you. If you have questions afterwards, reach out to us all the time. We're very excited, of course, to talk about this and very grateful for your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.